Over the past 2 months, I have read over 29 plus a few extras of your manhwa recommendations. And this is part 2 of an originally 35-minute video that I split in half. And this has been a fairly entertaining experience. But first, I want to mention that this video will be structured entirely different from the first half. You see, I want to mention a manhwa I actually gave a second chance, and that is SSS Class Revival Hunter, because originally in the first video I rated this a 0 out of 10, and I still believe that this was a fair rating in all honesty. But I also want to bring up this comment here to confirm that yes, I am biased, but this is because I believe that the system window is the worst thing to ever happen to all manhwa and manga. To me, the system window is lazy. I see this as an excuse to not put any real thought into how characters actually get their abilities, or how they grow in them, or the many things that exist in fantasy worlds. An example is how typically the system window allows its characters to store things within it as if it were an inventory. But something like this isn't needed because, in my opinion, there are many ways to ground an inventory into both the world and the story, such as a bag of holding from D&D, which is a magical bag that can hold lots of things as if it were endless on the inside. If an author gave this to the character, I wouldn't question it at all because it's understandable that something like this would exist in a world where magic does. And the same goes for skill-based stories, because I won't dare call something like this a power system. To me, a power system is a foundation, regardless of whether it's a hard or soft system. Power systems all have their own innate internal logic and style of progression, which shapes how characters receive their powers. Skills in this context are always the same in these general settings. They're always one-off singular abilities that do one or two things depending on how rare they are. Authors that use skills typically ignore or don't explain how these skills are gained, or the reason is related to experience points or innate talent, or the character simply awakening, which is consistently seen in stories that involve hunters, gates, and the system window, which is what I find lazy. I like the explanation of a system rules. I enjoy learning how a character gets stronger and the reasons they are at the same time they do. In stories that use the system window and hunter grades, skip past this or outright don't have it at all. By the way, if you guys are enjoying this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 10,000. Thank you. This same thing is of course present in Revival Hunter. The only quirk or novelty is how the main character actually acquires these skills, which is by dying. A skill he gained at the beginning of the story called I Want to Be Like You allows him a random skill from an enemy who kills him. But this randomness is discarded later anyways, as he gets another skill that just allows him to choose which one he wants. And this is that laziness and lack of internal logic that I'm talking about, and is present in many similar stories. Many of these hunter main characters always receive an X factor, or a cheat skill, or just the system window in order to completely shirk their progression. It's the main reason why I gave it a 0 out of 10 last time. It's not like I don't see the appeal of the system window or the general idea behind it. People who read these manhwa enjoy the idea of getting dropped into a video game world, and they're able to live and interact with it as if they're still playing the game by upgrading their stats, getting a class, and leveling up skills. I understand the thought process, but I truly do prefer to see real training and a real power or magic system in play when reading an action fantasy story, which Revival Hunter doesn't really have. And I'll tell you right now, it's not a 0 out of 10 for me anymore, but without lying to you, its new rating hasn't really improved much. This is because during this reread, it hasn't shown me anything really new from typical hunter stories, which is primarily what I was looking for during my reading of these 29 stories. It does at least use the system window in a different manner by allowing it to have some more non-combative, more video gamey aspects at times, but the first 2 arcs really don't help this story, and it's also technically a regression story, which I don't like either, because all regression stories are basically written the same. This guy goes back in time pretty far to kill someone who killed him, and then his whole life magically improves from then on. He's making connections with people he couldn't or envied in his previous life, which is all that's ever possible in regression stories. I'm dead ass. Think about every regression story you've ever read and convince me that this isn't what every regression MC doesn't do bar for bar. His goal is to live a life being acknowledged by the guildmasters, as in, I suppose, the other timeline. He lived his life wanting to be a legendary hunter, and he ends up achieving this, and this is part of that acknowledgement. But these present elements in these first two arcs still dim the story down as a whole. In chapter 32, he declares that he wants to protect those around him, and that he wants to be better than Flame Emperor. And he's redoing this fight with a boss over and over again in order to make sure that everyone lives, which you guys mentioned to be the moment the author locks in, which does feel slightly redundant, but it is where these stories' existing characters begin showing a lot more emotional depth. The guildmasters begin displaying actual personalities and character quirks that make them seem like more than just figureheads, like the Witch of the Black Dragon and how she cares about the amount of casualties, making him soft reset in order to change her reaction to the amount. And then in chapter 34, he receives a skill called 100 Ghost Summons, which is totally not helping this series case. Even though he doesn't use it the same way, at least where I am currently, this is making him seem extremely similar to one particular character I know. And then in chapter 35, he gets this corny title calling him the King Who Reaps Death. Like, are you serious right now? Like, is this your guys's like ultimate story? Like, this is what you're reading on a Friday night? You get off work and this is what you decide to read? One of the highlights of the series, according to you guys, is supposedly where I am in this Murim zombie arc, which I do think started off pretty good, and there's tons of emotional and character complexity, mainly showcased from the sect leaders and their resilience to remain loyal to their disciples in this arc, which is a real jump from the first two arcs. But here's the thing. I had a friend who helped me write this script. You know, they looked over it, and with their very keen eyes, they told me to stop underselling my opinion. So you know what? This shit sucks. This isn't nearly good enough for me to read it twice and magically say, oh my goodness, it's so much better than I initially thought. But I'll be honest, reading this again and further only made me dislike it more. I know how to hate it more efficiently now. And what's worse is that I read something I liked more while writing this script, being a manhwa called Island of Stars and Chains, which is wildly enough an urban fantasy hunter manhwa. But I like many things about this manhwa. Its art is wonderfully unique and colorful. The MC is actually an underdog and stays one. It's turned what I would consider typical hunter manhwa stuff into an actual power system with rules and categories that detail explicitly how characters' powers function, which is the best part about it. There are 5 classes in this manhwa. The first is Sentinel. These guys are like a classic warrior, and the manhwa even explains them that way. Next is Summoner, which is actually what the MC is, but they can summon weapons that are unique to them with a special power of its own. Next is Hexmage, which can imbue mental energy into objects and control them. They can even cause hallucinations, but they need like a wand or a medium to actually do it. Next is the Spirit Mage, and they can summon and command spirits like this guy who controls water, and created this amazing scene. It's cool because this manhwa actually explains that the spirits have a mind of their own and how this class is different from a hex mage. Lastly is Mattersmiths, who can use these tomes with specialized equations to manipulate materials around them. These classes run off a pretty typical hunter grade and inner force foundation, but it's so simple because through this medium, characters can actually have interesting abilities and unique ways of growing stronger. And what's even cooler is that there's another form of power present in this manhwa called Homecomers, whose minds or physical bodies went to another realm and fight basically that realm's equivalent of a demon king, and they come back keeping those powers from then, and Homecomers are way stronger than average hunters. It's just something like on the side that's really cool. If it wasn't a hunter manhwa, I'd give it a 10 out of 10, but it's a cool 7 because it's also quite funny and references a lot of movies and memes. Revival Hunter is a cool 5 out of 10, and I wasn't lying to you guys when I said I was starting to like it. This wasn't a lie, trust, but this is nowhere near the best of everything I've read. Reading all these manhwa has only cemented something I had already suspected. Something very crucial, and it's definitely an opinion that could ruffle some of you guys' feathers. But action fantasy manhwa as a whole may, as I say, may never have a story as good or as complex as Bleach. Which I know isn't really fair, and I'm only using it as a benchmark because I've read it twice and watched it. Bleach has been around for 24 years. It's had time for people to analyze its qualities and finer narrative aspects and really judge it in comparison to other shonen manga. So you really can't not only compare all of action fantasy manhwa to it, but you also can't use it as a good baseline for individual stories. But my main point here is that the bar for manhwa, to me, specifically to me as an opinion, is very, very low. And that's not to say that some stories aren't exceptional. It's just that they'll always be at the top, the tippy top of this very low bar compared to the very high bar that is manga. Both mediums, of course, share pros and cons because they're both a comic medium. The biggest thing being tropes. Both manhwa and manga have tropes that do consistently reappear in the series you may read. In both mediums, the idea of an overpowered character, or in even more recent instances, regression and isekai, saturate the current scene, which I don't really have to dive into because it's self-explanatory. But this is an easy segue into an opinion I've voiced in previous videos, that people are going to make what works, and in turn, this lessens the amount of potentially unique stories. I want to talk about a manga called Alien Headbutt that was axed, and I also want to bring up a manga that was serialized at the same time called Kinato's Magic. Alien Headbutt was a story about a man named Toga who wanted to be a wrestler, and he became one and went back to his home island only to find it overrun with aliens. He becomes infected with a parasite that makes him much stronger than the average human, so now he can compete with aliens using his own specialized wrestling techniques. Pretty amazing but distinct concept for a story, but it's the same uniqueness that inevitably got it axed because it wasn't a typical setup that people could easily settle into. Where on the other hand, you have Kinato's Magic, which I'll say outright, it is a very typical kind of story. Kinato leaves his humble home in order to become an adventurer with a childhood friend of his and joins what is essentially the story's equivalent of the Magic Knights. And this is basically his story of how he becomes more confident and a lot stronger so far. This setup is very comfortable, which is why it's still around. But you know what's hilarious? It's actually not still around because I found out while editing this video that it actually was axed. I literally just found out while editing, which is extremely frustrating. So my entire point literally doesn't even matter now. The situation creates what I want to call a sort of feedback loop in which there's only so much inspiration that can be drawn from reading all these stories with comfortable setups. So people will only write things that are similar and won't write anything new. Not only because this is all they know, but also because the audience won't be comfortable with anything new, which is why manhwa as a medium is saturated with the system, necromancy, villainess stories, tycoon manhwa, regression, Murim stories, ranked hunters, noble house settings, and reincarnation. All of these overused tropes are the result of this feedback loop, and manga is of course the same way. But that's enough of that. I'm sure you guys aren't here to hear me rant about my dislike of manhwa. You're here because you want to hear about your recommendations. See, I decided to structure this video differently. Rather than each story getting its own segment, the manhwa will be grouped together based on their qualities. So for example, all the medieval fantasy stories are now one group and they will supplement this rant. Modern fantasy manhwa, or urban fantasy as I really should say, can always end up being the same. And by modern fantasy, I mean stories that take place in modern day Korea or somewhere else. And typically it's a hunter manhwa, which is genuinely heartbreaking. But you guys have recommended manhwa which break the mold very well. And a benchmark for this is Handjumper. Handjumper is genuinely an amazing story, and I'm like a real sucker for this kind of albeit familiar setup. I may even be perpetuating my statement from earlier, but in Handjumper, the world is full of aberrants, which are humans that can manipulate the essence within them to strengthen, heal, and even use a special gift, which is a power unique to them. Aberrants are hated by everyone, even the main character whose sister just so happens to be one, and it's also revealed that being one is genetic. So Seon Lee, our main character, is forced to join the Aberrant Corps. It's a pretty entertaining ride from then on. Seon Lee is a very, very good main character with some real depth and quirks, unlike typical manhwa protagonists. And like I said, I'm a real sucker for this type of story. For me, it really sets the standard for all modern fantasy manhwa. The other stories like Dungeon Odyssey, Shamanism, Chiosu Saves the World, and The Warrior Returns, and A Mark Against Thee, which are all definitely enjoyable series. Dungeon Odyssey with the way it handles the labyrinth and how people explore it. Shamanism is a very weird but cool mix of concepts between shamanism and stock trading, as shamans use their powers in order to sway the stock market. I don't know how anybody like came up with that, but that's actually like really cool. And it was actually something I put on this list because I wanted to share it with you guys. And Chiosu with how he fosters new connections every time to achieve his goal, and the warrior returns with reverse isekai being a phenomena, and the variety of heroes is a real standout to me. A Mark Against Thee has its own emotional realism that is present in other stories like Windbreaker, and it's really good, but one that really lacked in comparison was Player, and the only reason it's here is because of the type of isekai it is. It just really didn't stand out in any way to me. Next is medieval fantasy, which is somewhat self-explanatory. It's just a story that takes place in a somewhat medieval world with knights, a king, or nobles. Stories like this can also always have some pretty typical elements, but quite a few of these are standouts. I'd say they even stand at the top of that very low bar I mentioned earlier. They even kind of stand above it, if I'm being honest. The standout for this group is actually kind of undecided because all three I'll mention I like a whole lot, but for different reasons. Not only that, they all have the same one reason. These standouts are Stellar Swordmaster, Ember Knight, and Happy Face. All three of these manhwa share themes of being a knight and have a knight's code or swordmaster's code, which actually has a presence within the story and influences the choices characters make, which is a very satisfying element. Happy Face stands out for its character growth, connections, and choreography. William and Happy are two amazing main characters with different origins, but they make great friends and there are a lot of cool fights. Stellar Swordmaster also has great character growth, but what stood out to me most was how they managed to turn aura, magic, and holy power into an actually complex system, and it was also the first manhwa that showed me the Swordmaster's code. Ember Knight stands out for its choreography, the presence and nature of knights within the story. It really goes in depth into how power and what people choose to do with it matter, and even how weakness can be a weapon and how its main character has different strengths. All three of these are fighting for the benchmark spot as I continue to read them. The other story that's by no means bad but I do really enjoy but isn't close to my top 3 is Warrior Executioner, which I really like because it actually gives a grounded in universe reason for people having skills, which is what I mentioned earlier. In this world, the goddess granted people 2 different types of skills so they can hold their own against the other races. And there's romance! Listen man, I really like a good romance subplot because it allows me to be part of something I can't have myself. But there are 2 that I really don't like, and the first is Steel Emperor, which was just a huge letdown. It's one of those stories where the main character is reborn as someone else, but it has one unique element in its Gagans, which are cool giant knight mechs, but they aren't the main focus, which sucks. I wish the story was more so about being like an artificer, but it just isn't. It's just a typical reincarnation manhwa. But this next one, I didn't dislike it, but also didn't enjoy it as much as the other. The Reincarnation of the Veteran Soldier is a very comedic isekai story, and at times well drawn, but it's just not super funny to me. But I am going to keep reading this one as I'm just not super far into it. And the last one in this particular category that isn't Murim, because Murim is going to be its own segment, but On My Way to Meet Mom doesn't really fit into either of these groups, but it is a pretty actually funny story and wholesome. It's a short story, but it's like ongoing right now. I think it's like monthly, about this really pretty much young toddler leaving his orphanage to find his real mother, and in the outside world he is met with many unique creatures and other non-human characters with great designs. I actually quite like it. And lastly is the Murim recommendations, and I have some very big and frustrating words for the Murim genre as a whole, and I want to come out of the gate and say that Legend of the Northern Blade is the best Murim manhwa out of all the others, and I believe I have a really good reason for this. You see, Murim stories are their own type of fantasy, different from high fantasy or any other type of fantasy, being the core of a martial arts fantasy with flashy moves, big flashy names, and generally the idea of a cool group of martial artists. Why do you think movies like Karate Kid and Kung Fu Hustle are really good movies? It's because these 2 movies capture that martial artist fantasy, and Legend of the Northern Blade captures this essence, literally becomes this martial artist fantasy. And it does that through the art, because this art looks so sick and picture book-esque and ancient. Reading this felt like I was reading a movie. This scene in the rain from chapter 37 where 2 characters are standing off has so much tension. You can literally feel the tension oozing off the page, especially with the rain and how the panel was angled. It was this fight that made me fall in love with Legend of the Northern Blade, and it's not that, it's mainly because there's an actual story here that is explained from the very beginning. And to cut it short, Jin's father was betrayed and his entire sect was destroyed. He spent time training and now he's searching for someone close to him. I said that really fast, I apologize. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I explained it that way because you just have to read it for yourself. And there's many background elements at play during this story as well, making it a really deep story. The next two are also really fun stories because they support that martial artist fantasy in a really unique way, because their stories simply just take place in a Murim world. Gosu is really resemblant of an old colored manga. It seriously reminds me of early Dragon Ball with its comedic nature, and its earlier chapters are kind of like an anthology where the MC Gang Ryong delivers food to people and ends up in various situations. Gang Ryong is really strong but kind-hearted, making for an ultimately satisfying story, and the action is really good as well. As for the third, being Peerless Dad, which has a not really similar situation. I don't know why I wrote this in the script, but the main character No Gajang was training under a master who said he'd never become strong, so he spent most of his life as a mercenary until he found the love of his life. But he unfortunately ends up as a single father of 3 and decides to join a sect so he can get welfare benefits, a free education, and a house close to his job, which I'm sure some of you probably want. I'm sure some of you probably really want that. But Peerless Dad is a really heartwarming story and a funny series. There are a lot of details I'm leaving out, but it's, once again, like I said, a great story because it simply just takes place in a Murim world without having any X factors like regression or reincarnation. If anything, the X factor is the fact that this dude is a single father. And like I said, all 3 of these are great examples of that martial arts fantasy. But that brings me to my next opinion, and that's that none of the other Murim stories capture this martial arts fantasy. None of them. Look, I know a lot of you like Return of the Blossoming Blade, and I'll admit, I did really like the way the story emphasizes the love and importance of manhwa rather than throwing it away. But all this made me realize that it's just another one of those tycoon manhwas where like somebody like comes back to life and they're like, oh no, my kingdom is in ruin, and then they build up the everything and then they talk to people. I talked about this all before, and this last part is slightly sloppy, but believe me. And I didn't realize it at first because it was just disguised as a cultivation manhwa, because this guy spends all his time cultivating chi, which is like an X factor that I didn't really talk about. I think I may talk about it, but I mean, I'm not sure. And reincarnation of an unruly heir, I literally fell asleep reading this. You know, phones usually are pretty good at keeping you up because you're forcing your brain to stay active with all the extra stimuli and whatnot. But I was trying to stay awake. Usually you don't have to try to stay awake when you're staying up like that, but I was trying. I was attempting, struggling to stay awake reading this, and I just couldn't. I literally fell asleep reading this. Do you know what that means? That means that this was so ass. It was so bad that it literally wasn't even giving me the quote-unquote extra stimuli I needed to stay awake. That's how bad this was. I'm gonna cut to the chase. I think that I just like the stories without reincarnation or any typical manhwa X factors that they add in, so the other guys like Miss Might Mayhem, Absolute Regression, I don't even want to waste my time on. Listen, this video took a really long time to make, and if you made it literally all 21 minutes, you are like literally the best person ever. I'm gonna be really straightforward. This is like the last manhwa video I'll ever make. I don't like making manhwa videos because manhwa panels just suck to edit. I said it before, this is the last one I'm ever gonna make unless this video hits like, you know what, I won't even be like unless, but like in order for me to make one other one, I would literally have to like see like incredible growth. And I don't, it's not like I'm holding manhwa ransom from you guys. I'm just saying I don't ever want to make another one again. So like, I'm not gonna make another one again, if that makes sense. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget this:
Fear God, love Jesus.
Peace.
In case I don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.